I trusted my son with my will, and somehow my daughter-in-law ended up owning my future. That was the sentence Margaret Whitmore repeated quietly to herself the morning everything began to make sense. At 72, Margaret had never imagined she would be the kind of woman who questioned her own family. For most of her life, trust had been the foundation of everything she built. She and her late husband Thomas had spent more than 40 years creating a life that was stable, careful, and comfortable. Their home in Connecticut sat on 2 quiet acres at the end of a maple-lined road. Inside that house were decades of ordinary memories, Sunday breakfasts, birthday dinners, winter evenings by the fireplace. Margaret believed those memories meant something permanent. When Thomas passed away 3 years earlier, she handled the grief the same way she handled most things in life, quietly and with dignity. She paid the bills, kept the house running, and slowly began organizing the paperwork that couples usually manage together. Bank accounts, insurance policies, investment statements, and eventually, the will. Margaret was not a wealthy woman by the standards of Manhattan or Silicon Valley, but she and Thomas had saved carefully. There was the house, several retirement accounts, and a small portfolio of conservative investments Thomas had built over the years. It was enough to make planning important, enough to require clarity about the future. Margaret never considered hiding any of this from her family. In fact, she believed transparency would make things easier. Her only child, Daniel Whitmore, had always been a steady presence in her life. As a boy, he was thoughtful and quiet. As an adult, he worked as a financial consultant and seemed responsible with money. If there was anyone Margaret believed she could trust with sensitive decisions, it was Daniel. That was why, one autumn afternoon nearly 8 months earlier, she invited him over for coffee and placed a thin folder on the kitchen table. The folder contained the original will she and Thomas had written years ago with their attorney, Robert Klein. Margaret remembered the way Daniel leaned forward, studying the papers carefully, nodding as she explained what she wanted to update. She was older now. Circumstances had changed. Some details needed adjusting. Daniel listened patiently, asking practical questions, offering to help coordinate with the attorney. At the time, Margaret felt relieved. Handling legal paperwork alone could feel overwhelming, and having Daniel involved made the process seem simpler. Of course, Daniel was not the only new presence in the Whitmore family anymore. His wife Olivia had been part of their lives for nearly a decade. Olivia was intelligent, polished, and confident in a way that sometimes made Margaret feel slightly out of step with modern life. Still, Margaret believed she had welcomed Olivia generously from the beginning. Holidays were shared at the Whitmore house. Birthdays were celebrated around the same dining table Margaret had polished every Thanksgiving since the early 1990s. Nothing about those moments suggested that something was quietly shifting beneath the surface. Looking back later, Margaret would realize the change had been subtle. It began with small conversations. Casual remarks about how complicated estates could become. Comments about how older people often struggled to manage financial decisions on their own. At the time, those statements sounded like concern. Responsible advice. Margaret never suspected they might also be preparation for something else entirely. Because while Margaret believed she was simply asking her son for help reviewing a will, someone else in that room had already begun imagining how that will could be rewritten. During the weeks that followed that quiet conversation in the kitchen, Margaret Whitmore believed everything was moving forward exactly as it should. Daniel contacted Robert Klein, the attorney who had handled the Whitmore family paperwork for more than 2 decades, and explained that his mother wanted to review her estate plan. Robert was familiar with the family history and trusted Daniel enough to schedule a preliminary review. Margaret assumed that when the time came she would sit across the same polished conference table she had used years earlier with her husband Thomas. Instead, most of the early conversations happened without her present. Daniel assured her it was only the administrative stage. Documents needed to be organized. Accounts needed to be listed. It sounded reasonable, and Margaret had always been the kind of person who appreciated efficiency. Olivia seemed particularly interested in helping Daniel prepare. She often asked questions during family dinners that sounded harmless on the surface. She wondered whether the Connecticut house might become difficult to maintain someday. She mentioned how many older homeowners eventually chose to simplify their living arrangements. She even suggested that complicated estates sometimes caused conflict among relatives if the paperwork was not extremely clear. Margaret listened. politely, and believed Olivia was simply being thoughtful. After all, Olivia had a background in marketing and often spoke with the calm confidence of someone used to presenting ideas. Nothing about her tone sounded hostile. If anything, she seemed eager to help the family avoid confusion in the future. Looking back later, Margaret would realize how carefully those conversations were shaped. They never sounded like demands. They sounded like practical observations. And over time Daniel began repeating the same points as if they had become his own thoughts. One evening, he explained that modern estate planning often included trusts that allowed assets to be managed more efficiently. Another time, he suggested that simplifying ownership could protect Margaret from unnecessary paperwork as she grew older. Margaret noticed the pattern but did not question it. She trusted Daniel not only as her son, but also as someone who worked in finance. When he said something made sense, she believed him. Meanwhile, Robert Klein received a steady flow of information from Daniel about the proposed changes. Lists of accounts, property descriptions, investment summaries. Everything appeared thorough and organized. Yet Robert could not ignore one small detail that continued to bother him. Margaret herself had not called. In the past, she had always spoken directly with him about major decisions. Still, Daniel assured him that his mother preferred letting him coordinate the early stages so she would not have to worry about paperwork. Robert accepted the explanation for the moment. Families often delegated responsibilities like this. But as the weeks passed, Olivia's presence in the discussions seemed to grow stronger. She attended several meetings with Daniel and occasionally offered suggestions about how the estate structure could be modernized. Her ideas were presented politely, framed as improvements that would make management easier in the long run. Daniel listened carefully to every one of them. And step by step, small revisions began appearing in the draft documents that Robert was preparing. None of the changes looked dramatic on their own. A clause adjusted here, a management authority updated there. But together they slowly shifted the balance of control away from Margaret and toward a structure that placed decision-making somewhere else entirely. By early winter, the process had taken on a rhythm that felt routine to everyone except Robert Klein. Each time Daniel visited his office, he arrived with neatly organized folders and clear instructions about what adjustments needed to be reflected in the new estate documents. Daniel spoke calmly and confidently, explaining that his mother wanted the plan to be modern and efficient. Olivia sometimes accompanied him, sitting quietly at first, then offering small suggestions that sounded thoughtful and practical. She often talked about protecting Margaret from complicated financial decisions as she grew older, and Daniel nodded, as if the idea had already been discussed at home. Robert listened carefully because he had spent more than 25 years advising families, and he knew how estate planning conversations usually unfolded. Normally, the person whose estate was being planned asked the questions directly. Normally, that person reviewed each change personally. Margaret Whitmore had always been careful and detail-oriented when she handled legal matters with her late husband Thomas. Yet now the information was traveling through Daniel and Olivia instead of coming from Margaret herself. Robert told himself there might be a simple explanation. Many adult children helped their parents with paperwork, especially when financial documents began to pile up. Still, he kept a close eye on the revisions appearing in the draft will. The first few adjustments seemed harmless enough. Some language about property maintenance was simplified. A section describing the management of the investment accounts was updated so that Daniel could assist if Margaret ever became unable to handle financial decisions herself. That change alone could have been considered normal. But as the drafts continued evolving, the structure of control began to shift in ways that Robert could not ignore. A new legal entity appeared in the paperwork, described as a family trust designed to hold most of Margaret's assets. Daniel and Olivia were listed together as future trustees responsible for managing those assets. At first, Margaret would remain the primary decision-maker, but the documents also created provisions allowing authority to move to the trustees under certain conditions. Daniel explained that this structure would protect Margaret from administrative burdens. Olivia added that many families used similar arrangements to keep estates organized and efficient. Their explanations sounded professional and reasonable, yet Robert noticed that each modification gradually moved control away from Margaret and toward the new trust. One afternoon, he reviewed the latest version of the draft and leaned back in his chair, studying the pages carefully. Something about the pattern felt wrong. None of the changes were dramatic on their own. Each adjustment looked like a technical improvement, but taken together they told a quiet story of power shifting hands. Robert checked his notes from previous meetings and realized that Margaret had still not appeared in his office to confirm any of these updates personally. That absence continued to trouble him. Meanwhile, Margaret remained in her quiet Connecticut home, unaware of the details unfolding in those legal documents. Her days followed the same peaceful routine she had known for years. Morning coffee near the kitchen window. A short walk down the gravel driveway to collect the mail. Occasional phone calls with Daniel about ordinary family matters. Whenever the subject of the estate appeared, Daniel reassured her that everything was progressing smoothly. Margaret believed him because trust had always been the language of her family. She could not see the careful adjustments taking shape inside the legal paperwork. She could not hear the subtle shifts happening during meetings she never attended. And because she believed the process was simply administrative, she did not realize that the future she had planned with such quiet care was slowly being rearranged page by page. Robert Klein had spent most of his career believing that legal documents told quiet stories about the people who signed them. Every clause revealed an intention. Every revision suggested a motive. As he studied the newest draft of Margaret Whitmore's estate plan late one evening in his office, the story unfolding across those pages began to trouble him more than he expected. The language appeared polished and technically correct, but the direction of the changes was impossible to ignore. The trust now held nearly every major asset Margaret owned. The Connecticut house, the retirement accounts, even the small charitable fund she had once mentioned creating in her late husband Thomas's memory. Daniel and Olivia were listed together as future trustees with authority to manage the estate if Margaret became unable to make decisions herself. On paper, the structure looked efficient and modern, but Robert noticed something that did not fit Margaret's personality. The new version also limited Margaret's direct authority over several financial decisions once the trust became active. In practical terms, she would still live in her home and continue her daily life, but the ultimate control of the estate would gradually shift to the trustees. Robert leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses, thinking carefully about the woman he had known for decades. Margaret Whitmore was thoughtful and polite, but she was not careless. She had always reviewed legal documents line by line with quiet patience. It seemed unlikely that she would approve such significant changes without asking detailed questions. That uncertainty stayed with Robert the next morning as he prepared to finalize the next revision of the draft. Daniel had scheduled another meeting for the afternoon, and as expected he arrived with Olivia by his side. They both looked relaxed, speaking about the estate plan as if everything were progressing smoothly. Daniel explained that his mother trusted them to help manage the process so she would not have to deal with complicated paperwork. Olivia added that Margaret had often mentioned wanting the transition to be simple when the time eventually came for Daniel to handle family responsibilities. Robert listened without interrupting. He had heard similar explanations before in other families, but something about the pace of these revisions continued to feel unusually fast. When the conversation paused, he asked a single careful question. He asked whether Margaret planned to review the next draft personally before anything was finalized. Daniel answered quickly that his mother would sign the documents once everything was prepared. Olivia nodded and added that Margaret preferred to avoid long meetings because legal discussions sometimes felt overwhelming. Robert said nothing more in that moment. Instead, he simply closed the folder and thanked them for the update. After they left the office, he sat quietly for several minutes, considering the situation. Lawyers were trained to respect the instructions of their clients, but they were also responsible for ensuring that those instructions truly came from the person whose name appeared on the document. And in this case, that person had not yet confirmed anything directly. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her calm routine at home. Believing the legal updates were only minor adjustments Daniel was helping coordinate. She watered the small garden behind the house even as autumn leaves gathered along the wooden fence. She spoke with neighbors about ordinary things like weather and grocery prices. Nothing in her peaceful daily life suggested that complicated legal arrangements were being constructed in distant conference rooms. Yet within those quiet pages of paperwork, the future she thought she understood was becoming something very different. The turning point began with a phone call that Margaret Whitmore did not expect. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning while she was standing at the kitchen counter sorting through the day's mail. The caller identification displayed the name Robert Klein, and Margaret answered with the calm familiarity of someone who had known the same attorney for many years. Robert's voice sounded polite as always, but there was a careful hesitation behind his words that Margaret immediately noticed. He asked how she had been feeling lately and whether everything at home was going well. Margaret assured him that life was quiet and comfortable. She told him she had been spending more time in her garden and occasionally visiting the small bookstore in town that she liked so much. For a moment the conversation sounded like an ordinary friendly check-in. Then Robert asked a question that caused Margaret to pause. He asked whether she had recently decided to remove herself as the primary authority over several parts of her estate. Margaret stood very still beside the kitchen window. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, but did not open it. The question did not make sense to her. She answered slowly that she had not made any such decision. Robert remained silent for a few seconds before explaining that the newest draft of her estate plan included language suggesting that most financial decisions would eventually be controlled by the trust managed by Daniel and Olivia. Margaret felt a quiet confusion settle over her thoughts. She remembered asking Daniel to help coordinate a few updates to the will, but she had never discussed removing her own authority. Robert explained the situation carefully, making sure his tone remained respectful and neutral. He told Margaret that the documents were still drafts and nothing had been finalized yet. However, the changes were significant enough that he wanted to confirm her intentions directly. Margaret thanked him for calling and asked if she could come to his office the next morning to review the paperwork in person. After she ended the call, she remained standing in the same place for several minutes. The kitchen clock ticked quietly on the wall, while sunlight moved slowly across the floor. Margaret tried to recall every conversation she had recently shared with Daniel and Olivia. She remembered Olivia speaking often about simplifying the estate. She remembered Daniel explaining that modern trusts could make financial management easier. At the time, those conversations had sounded practical and responsible. Now they felt slightly different when viewed from this new angle. The next morning, Margaret drove the familiar 30-minute route to Robert Klein's office in the neighboring town. The building looked exactly the same as it had when she and Thomas first visited years earlier. When Robert welcomed her inside, he placed a thick folder on the conference table and opened it carefully. Margaret began reading the pages one by one. At first, the legal language looked ordinary. Then she reached the sections describing the trust structure and the authority assigned to Daniel and Olivia. Margaret read those lines twice. Then she slowly looked up from the document, realizing that the future described in those pages was not the one she believed she had planned. Margaret Whitmore did not rush through the documents. She read them slowly, the way she had always approached important decisions during the years she and Thomas managed their finances together. Each page revealed another detail that felt slightly unfamiliar. The structure of the estate had changed more than she expected. The trust described in the paperwork now held authority over nearly everything she owned, including the Connecticut house, the investment accounts, and the savings she and Thomas had built across 4 decades of careful planning. Margaret remained quiet as she continued reading, but Robert Klein watched her expression closely from across the conference table. He could see the moment when realization began settling into her thoughts. The language in the draft was clear. Daniel and Olivia would eventually serve as the primary trustees managing the assets. Certain provisions even allowed their authority to become active if Margaret was ever considered unable to handle financial decisions on her own. In that situation, the control of the estate would shift almost entirely to them. Margaret finally closed the folder and rested her hands gently on the table. Her voice remained calm when she spoke. She asked Robert whether she had signed anything that allowed those changes to become official. Robert answered carefully that nothing had been finalized yet. The documents in front of her were still drafts waiting for final confirmation and signatures. That answer brought Margaret a quiet sense of relief, but it also deepened the questions forming in her mind. She asked Robert to explain exactly how these revisions had developed. Robert described the meetings he had held with Daniel over the past several months and the suggestions Olivia had occasionally offered during those discussions. He emphasized that he had assumed the ideas reflected Margaret's wishes because Daniel had presented them as decisions already agreed upon at home. Margaret listened without interrupting. She was not a woman who reacted quickly to surprising information. Instead, she reviewed each detail carefully, placing the pieces together the same way someone might examine a complicated puzzle. She remembered the conversations at her kitchen table when Daniel and Olivia had spoken about simplifying financial matters for the future. At the time, she believed they were only discussing small administrative updates. She had never imagined those conversations could lead to such significant changes in the control of her estate. Robert eventually asked the question that had been on his mind since the first moment he noticed the unusual revisions. He asked Margaret directly whether the current draft truly reflected what she wanted for her future. Margaret looked down at the open folder once more. The pages described a future where the authority she once held would gradually pass into someone else's hands. She thought about the quiet home she still cared for every day. She thought about the years she and Thomas had spent building their savings together. Then she closed the folder again and shook her head slowly. She told Robert that the future described in those documents was not the one she had ever intended. For the first time since the process had begun, Margaret Whitmore understood that the plan she believed she was organizing had quietly become something very different. Margaret Whitmore did not react with anger. Instead, she sat quietly across from Robert Klein and allowed the silence in the room to settle. For a woman who had lived more than 70 years, surprises were rarely handled with loud emotions. They were handled with patience and careful thinking. Robert waited respectfully, giving her the time she needed to absorb what she had just read. Outside the office window, the late afternoon traffic moved slowly along the street, and the quiet hum of the building's heating system filled the room. Finally, Margaret looked up and asked a simple question. She asked Robert whether the situation could still be corrected before any final documents were signed. Robert answered without hesitation that it could. Because nothing had been finalized, the entire structure could still be rewritten to reflect Margaret's true intentions. The relief on her face was subtle but unmistakable. However, Margaret did not immediately begin dictating changes. Instead, she asked Robert to explain every step that would normally happen before a will became official. Robert described the legal process in detail. Drafts were prepared, reviewed, and then signed in the presence of witnesses. Only after those signatures were placed on the final document would the estate plan become legally binding. Margaret listened carefully to each explanation. When Robert finished speaking, she folded her hands on the table and looked thoughtful rather than upset. She said that she did not want to confront Daniel or Olivia yet. She explained that she preferred to understand exactly how the situation had developed before making any emotional decisions. Robert nodded because he had seen similar situations in other families. Confrontation often created confusion before the facts were fully understood. Margaret then asked another question that surprised him slightly. She asked whether it would be possible to allow Daniel and Olivia to believe the process was continuing exactly as they expected while she quietly reviewed her options. Robert considered the idea for a moment and then confirmed that it was entirely possible. As long as no final signatures had been placed on the documents, the drafts could remain flexible. Margaret slowly stood from the conference table and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street below. She thought about Daniel as a child learning to ride his bicycle in the driveway. She thought about the years when he came home from school and told her about his plans for the future. Trust had always been the foundation of their relationship, and the realization that something had shifted between them felt heavier than she wanted to admit. Yet Margaret Whitmore was not someone who allowed disappointment to control her decisions. She turned back toward Robert and thanked him for his honesty in calling her earlier that week. Then she made a calm request. She asked him to prepare a new version of the estate plan that reflected exactly what she wanted, not what others had suggested. Robert agreed and began gathering his notes while Margaret prepared to leave the office. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, she understood that the future she had planned was still within her control. The difference now was that she would be the one deciding how the next chapter would be written. During the following 2 weeks, Margaret Whitmore returned to the quiet rhythm of her ordinary life. But the calm she showed on the surface now carried a deeper awareness beneath it. Every morning, she followed the same routine she had known for years. She brewed her coffee, opened the kitchen curtains, and watched the early light stretch across the backyard. The maple trees behind the fence had already begun losing their leaves, covering the grass in thin layers of red and gold. Anyone who saw Margaret during those days would have believed nothing unusual was happening. She still spoke warmly with neighbors when she walked down the driveway to collect the mail. She still called Daniel once or twice during the week to ask about his work and how things were going at home. Daniel sounded relaxed during those conversations, exactly the way he always had. He told his mother that Robert Klein was continuing to prepare the final version of the estate documents and that everything would soon be ready for signatures. Margaret listened carefully each time he mentioned the process. She never corrected him. She never revealed that she had already read the drafts and understood how dramatically they had been altered. Instead, she simply thanked him for helping coordinate the paperwork and said she appreciated how organized he had been. Meanwhile, Robert Klein was quietly preparing a different set of documents inside his office. These papers reflected Margaret's true wishes rather than the structure Daniel and Olivia had proposed. The new plan restored Margaret's full authority over every part of the estate while she was alive. It also included clear instructions about how the assets would eventually be distributed. Daniel would still receive a generous inheritance, because Margaret had never intended to punish her son for the confusion that had developed. However, the control of the estate would no longer pass automatically to Daniel and Olivia through a trust that limited Margaret's independence. Instead, Robert drafted a structure that protected Margaret's decisions while ensuring that no future changes could occur without her direct approval. One afternoon, Margaret returned to Robert's office to review the new documents. This time, she read them slowly with a sense of calm clarity rather than confusion. Every clause reflected a choice she understood and agreed with. Robert explained the additional provisions he had included to prevent unauthorized revisions in the future. One section required that any future modifications to the estate plan must be discussed with Margaret personally and confirmed through direct communication. Margaret appreciated that detail because it restored the simple principle she believed had always guided family relationships: honesty. After she finished reviewing the paperwork, she signed the documents in the presence of the required witnesses. The signatures were placed quietly and without drama, but they carried enormous weight. In that moment, the future of the Whitmore estate was officially defined by Margaret's own decisions. When she left the office that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Daniel and Olivia still believed the original plan was moving forward exactly as they had arranged. They had no reason to suspect that the legal foundation beneath their expectations had already changed. Margaret Whitmore did not see this as revenge. She saw it as restoring the balance that should never have shifted in the first place. And as she drove home through the quiet Connecticut streets, she knew that the next time the subject of the estate appeared, the truth would reveal itself in a way no one could ignore. 3 weeks later, Margaret Whitmore invited Daniel and Olivia to dinner at the Connecticut house, the same place where the Whitmore family had gathered for holidays and birthdays for more than 40 years. The evening felt familiar from the moment they arrived. The dining table was set with the same white dishes Margaret had used since the early 1990s, and the soft light above the table made the room feel warm and ordinary. Daniel spoke easily about his work, while Olivia complimented Margaret on the meal she had prepared. Anyone watching the scene would have believed it was simply another quiet family visit. During dinner, Daniel eventually mentioned that Robert Klein had told him the estate documents were almost ready to finalize. He said that once the paperwork was complete, Margaret would only need to sign a few pages and the updated structure would be in place. Olivia nodded with quiet confidence, explaining that modern estate planning often required patience before the final documents were completed. Margaret listened calmly while they spoke. She thanked Daniel for the time he had spent helping organize everything, and said she appreciated how carefully he had followed the process. Her voice carried the same warmth it always had, and neither Daniel nor Olivia noticed anything unusual in her tone. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Margaret served coffee beside the fireplace. The conversation drifted toward ordinary topics again until Daniel asked whether Robert had contacted her to schedule the final signing appointment. Margaret placed her cup on the table and looked at her son with the steady calm that had guided most of her life. She told him that she had already visited Robert's office and that the documents had indeed been finalized. For a moment, Daniel looked relieved, believing everything had progressed exactly as planned. Then Margaret continued, speaking in the same measured voice. She explained that while reviewing the earlier drafts, she had realized several changes did not reflect the future she wanted for her estate. Because of that, she had asked Robert to prepare a different version of the plan, and she had signed those documents with the required witnesses earlier that week. The room became very quiet. Daniel asked what kind of changes she meant, and Margaret answered without accusation or anger. She explained that the new documents restored her full authority over every part of her estate while she was alive, and that any future revisions would require direct conversations with her rather than assumptions made by others. She also told him that the inheritance structure had been simplified so that no one could alter it without her clear approval. Olivia remained silent while Margaret spoke, her confident expression slowly fading as she understood what had happened. Margaret did not criticize them or raise her voice. She simply described the decisions she had made and the reasons behind them. By the end of the conversation, Daniel realized that the legal structure he believed was nearly complete had quietly changed weeks earlier. Margaret Whitmore had not confronted them with anger or accusation. Instead, she had calmly ensured that the future of the Whitmore estate would be written by the person who built it in the first place.